Well, good morning. Happy Friday, everybody. I hope the sun is shining for you as it is for me at the moment, and I hope you're looking forward to a nice weekend ahead. Today we're going to be having a discussion about wellbeing risk, and we've got a number of contributors joining today. Financial Services Culture Board, we have colleagues from CMHA Australia, and some of our members, senior sponsors, PwC, Standard Chartered, and the FCA. So I want to make this as informal as possible. So please, if you have any comments, questions throughout, please either put these in the chat or raise your hand. But hopefully we'll have some time at the end for discussion. So I think probably, just as an introduction, I thought it was probably quite helpful perhaps just to sort of think about what we mean when we're talking about wellbeing risk. And I think, for me, probably the thing that, comes to mind when I hear the word risk is really thinking about the kind of human cost and potential damage to health. And we have been sort of hearing more and more over the last sort of couple of years around this topic of psychosocial risk. So thinking about those work factors, so work design, management, autonomy, relationships, culture, all of which can have an impact on an individual's health. And I think ultimately the biggest risk there is the damage to psychological health and ultimately a worst case scenario, loss of life. There is also, when we're thinking about wellbeing risk as an organisation, the risk to growth and risk to your success as an organisation. And Barak from PwC is going to talk to us a little bit more shortly about a recent PwC survey. But in this survey, one of the things that was highlighted was that the workforce is the #1 risk to organisational growth. And really, I think, psychological health of your workforce is a really, helpful and a really good indicator, actually, of the kind of productivity, the performance, the sustainability of your organisation. And we're really only as good as the people that are working for us. And if your people are not well, then your organisation is not going to perform well. And John Flint, our Global Mindful Alliance Chair, spoke about this quite eloquently at the annual celebration event last year. So if you were not there or you have not watched the recording, I would really urge you to do so. But essentially, John's message was that, employee wellbeing is not just a moral thing to do. It's not the fluffy stuff. Actually, it's an indicator of the health of your organisation. And as a leader, it's not just about a business, an important business issue. You should be really thinking about this as a business critical issue and prioritising this as an organisation. Other risks we've seen around employee wellbeing relate to the experience of employees. We've seen a rise over the last couple of years of employee activism, so employees speaking out about behaviours, experiences of their workforce. There are a handful of organisations I could name who've been in the press around some of these issues. Brewdog is one that comes to mind. But there's also the ESG agenda, and mental health is a core part of the ESG agenda, and businesses are increasingly being measured on their responsible business efforts. And that does include the kind of support and protection of employee wellbeing. And there is a growing awareness amongst clients, consumers, customers, and who are putting more emphasis and more expectation on organisations to really prioritise and demonstrate credibility in this area. Now, employee wellbeing has been, a hot topic, particularly over the last couple of years. We have been, experiencing ongoing disruptions. We've had the pandemic, we've got, the economic climate, we've had, global and different social crises that we have been facing. So it's not a surprise that obviously we are seeing the increases in mental health issues. And there are reports suggesting that there's a 26% increase in the cases of depression, a 28% increase in the cases of anxiety globally. And, this is to be expected. It shouldn't really be a surprise to us. But I think from a risk perspective, one of the things that we're hearing more and more about is burnout and burnout risk. And we understand that burnout is at an all-time high. And there are figures suggesting that, 1 in 4, 1 in 3 of us are experiencing symptoms of burnout, stress and fatigue. And I think most concerningly, 60% of this is actually attributed to the workplace. Now, this issue will affect certain groups of employees more than others. Those with lower levels of flexibility, those with lower levels of kind of autonomy and control are disproportionately impacted. But as an organisation, you know, we are hearing increasingly from our leaders that they are feeling stressed, they are exhausted. And I think this additional burden of trying to protect and look after the well-being of teams, as well as manage an already huge workload with large responsibilities, is starting to take this toll. And I think the problem here is that, you know, when we are not well, we are unable to support people around us, perhaps as we are like, you know, as we would like to. When we are stressed, we are likely to behave differently. And these behaviours can cascade throughout the organisation, and actually the behaviours of just a few can actually have a wide impact on the behaviours of many. There was some research that was recently published by McKinsey that highlighted that toxic behaviour was one of the biggest issues for organisations in relation to burnout, and that individuals are 8 times more likely to experience burnout and 6 times more likely to leave an organisation if there was a toxic behaviour. Now, there are things that organisations are trying to do to mitigate against this. Things like resilience training is one of them. And whilst that can help in some way, you know, those are more likely to not tolerate toxic workplace environments and more likely to leave. And I think ultimately what this boils down to is that, you know, senior leadership behaviours here are really key in determining the culture of the workplace environment. And I will, you know, recommend to anyone that this is an area that we should be focusing on. Now, in terms of steps businesses are taking around wellbeing, I mean, we have seen, you know, over the last 10 years, but particularly in the last couple of years, that more and more businesses are investing in wellbeing. 4 in 5 organisations, according to McKinsey, say this is a top priority. 9 in 10 have introduced some kind of wellbeing programmes, wellbeing benefits. And whilst I think these are laudable efforts in terms of, you know, organisations trying to remedy, trying to support and protect employee wellbeing, they are really focused on individuals. So very much focused on that, helping the individual to solve some of these issues. And I think perhaps we may be overestimating the impact of some of these interventions. And I think what we need to do is actually look very closely at our organisations, you know, the systemic issues that may be impacting employee wellbeing. And these include work design, sustainable workloads, you know, the organisation, you know, the culture, the leadership behaviours, and really importantly, how inclusive your working environments are. Now, the McKinsey research, you know, when individuals were asked around what are the factors in the workplace that are impacting negatively on your well-being, the feedback was that it was the always-on culture. So, you know, technology has been incredibly helpful over the last, and particularly over the last couple of years, but people are feeling like they have to be, you know, on all the time. With, you know, the barrier between the workplace and home has been blurred, very much so. Unfair treatment was highlighted as a considerable issue. Unreasonable and unsustainable workloads, low autonomy, and lack of support from management. So, as I said, you know, it's not just looking at those individual interventions, it's looking at the organisation and how we're organising work. In relation to ways of working, one of the other things I'd just like to highlight is around the support networks that we have in place within the workplace. You know, we are typically across our membership, we are, you know, high intensity, high demand working environments. And I think pre-pandemic, when many of us were in the office environment, we garnered a lot of support from the people around us, the teams that we had. We are human creatures, we need social connection, we need human connection. And whilst it's great to have Zoom and calls and emails and instant messaging, we do get a lot of you know, social support by having those in-person connections. And I think one of the dangers and one of the risks that we have is that the new ways of working, you know, we are eroding those those human connections. And I think we need to think very carefully as we return to whatever the new normal is, and the impact potentially that will have on our well-being. The last point I want to make is around lack of data. So how, you know, what is the well-being in your organisation? How are you measuring this? You know, at any one point, do you understand how well your workers are feeling? Now, data is a challenge. I would signpost you to our data guide. There's some great information and advice around the collection and reporting of data. But it is something that I know many organisations do struggle with. So on that point around data, I think this is a great opportunity for me to introduce Rick Borges from the Financial Services Culture Board. Rick is the Director of Strategy, and Rick's going to share some insights and trends from the research data that you've gathered over the last 7 years. So Rick, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alison. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invite to come and participate in this session. It's a pleasure. So as Alison mentioned, we have been conducting our research for the past 7 years. We were before the Banking Standards Board, and we changed our name last year to increase our remit to financial services firms more broadly. We were set up after the financial crisis to help banks and building societies to improve the standards of behavior and competence after what was found in the several reviews of the misconduct and misbehavior that led to the crisis. And one of the first things that we did was to set up an assessment of organizational culture framework to understand the culture of these firms in the sector and in our membership. And that framework doesn't define what a good culture is, but has 9 characteristics that, if they are demonstrated, in our view, is likely that that firm has a good culture. And these characteristics are a behavior type like honesty, accountability, openness, and respect. Competence type, competence, reliability, responsiveness, and also personal resilience and organizational resilience. And in the middle of all of that is shared purpose. So we developed different methods to assess those 9 elements. One of our key and main method is an employee survey that we've been running for 7 years. We are just live now with the 7th cycle. And that survey has given us a very good indication of some of these aspects. And there are 2 particular statements in the survey out of 36 that cover personal resilience and well-being. One is we ask employees if they feel under excessive pressure to perform at work. And across the years, on average, 4 in 10 colleagues do feel excessive pressure to perform. And the other one is working at my organization impacts on my health and well-being. And on average, a quarter of employees feel a negative impact on their health and well-being. And these numbers, they varied slightly from year after year, but they kept quite stable. We saw some improvements in 2020, but we call it the COVID effect, when all firms focus on employee well-being and supporting them. But last year, the numbers went back to this average I've just given you. When I look at the correlation between these 2 questions with the other questions, there are 2 that I would like to highlight that are mostly correlated. One is colleagues that feel that work in their organization has a negative impact on their health and well-being. They are more likely to say they're not treated with respect. So there is a question we ask at work: I am treated with respect. Another one is on speaking up. So we have a question asking people, do you feel worried about raising concerns? Do you feel that if you raise concerns, you'd be worried about consequences? And people who are answering they have felt a negative impact on their well-being, they're more likely to say they fear consequences if they raise concerns. So that links to the psychological safety point, to this picking up culture. So people who are stressed and feeling unwell or having a psychological strain, they're less likely to raise concerns, and that increases the risks of unethical behavior or inappropriate behavior, or not raising such behaviors to others when needed. We also look at some demographics, and I pointed out 2 here. We have a range of demographics, but colleagues who are customer facing, they're more likely to feel under excessive pressure and that working has a negative impact on their well-being than colleagues who are non-customer facing. On the tenure point, as we know, as seen in other surveys and other researches, colleagues joining the organization the first year are more positive, and that kind of curve goes down and then improves again after 15 years. We also did some qualitative research on this topic. And in 19, we had, for the question on impact on well-being, for people who said they do feel an impact, we had a free text asking them, so why is it? What are the factors that it's impact on your healthy well-being? And we saw that, as Alison mentioned, workload was a main one, pressure of expectations, and resource constraint. So of the quarter of people who says they had an impact, the work was impacting their health and well-being, more than half cited workload. Other issues were mentioned, like management, working relationships, the physical environment, and organizational change. So the results, we know that FAMS has done a lot in this space, and they continue to do it. And what we also applied a technique when we run focus groups across firms. We had more than 80, 90 focus groups, and we divided them in two and applied a technique called grounded theory. So we looked at the firms that had good scores on well-being on those questions, and the firms that didn't have good scores. And then went through the focus groups data, the qualitative feedback given by employees, and we tried to identify the practices and the differences between the two. And for all the focus groups, workload and pressure and resource constraints was highlighted. But the main difference was on how firms dealt with it. So the high scoring firms, employees mentioned things like planning well and managing resources effectively, ensuring that line managers were supportive, effective implementation of flexible working policies, in particular trusting employees who used those flexible arrangements, and treating different parts of their firms consistently. On differences between areas, we have retail, investment banking, commercial banking, and functions in our banking sample. And investment banking colleagues are more likely to report impact on health and well-being, but less likely to report they feel under excessive pressure, indicating that the threshold of pressure is slightly different in that area. And finally, we have done a literature review in 19, and we identified 8 situational factors that impact on employee well-being and can be looked at by organizations if they want to improve the well-being of employees. And they won't be new to you, I'm sure, and Alison has mentioned many of them, but I just briefly, if I mention a couple of things. So work settings is the first one. So for example, research shows that exposure to bright light during the winter can improve well-being. Open spaces, green spaces as well. And also the ability to have space to interact with each other and to have autonomous work. And we have seen last year in one of our questions about the positive changes that firms put in place to deal with the pandemic and the negative changes that were in place and they should be reverted. Colleagues highlighted that they do miss the social connection, and some felt the lack of social connection impacts on their mental health. So that social capital that we build at seeing each other face to face is perhaps running out. Workload, I won't touch on that. I will just highlight that it's excessive workload, but also feeling underutilized. So research shows that colleagues who are not utilized have lower self-esteem, lack of sense of purpose, and have unhealthy and can adopt unhealthy habits. Job control and autonomy, it's another area. So ability of an employee to influence their work environment. And presenteeism, so coming to work feeling ill or not well enough that will impact on performance and the way they work. Job security and change, including financial well-being, is also important and relevant. Relationships at work. So, for example, there is research that shows that managers who behave in a very competitive manner, or with hostility or with exaggerated sense of time urgency, can have a serious impact on stress levels and lead to symptoms of depression, online reports. And organizational justice is another factor. So fairness of outcomes, fairness of procedures, and fairness on interpersonal treatment between employees is an area of importance as well. So perceived organizational injustice is associated with stress-related outcomes, including psychological strain, depression, emotional exhaustion, and counterproductive and harmful behaviors at work, which links to the risk point. And finally, work-life balance, that we are aware that the risk here is the blurred of the lines between home and work, that we're all aware. And finally, meaning at work, so the purpose of work that can improve well-being. But too much attachment to work can also lead to outcomes of personal sacrifice and burnout, as Alison mentioned. So Alison, I stopped there and happy to discuss when we come to the Q&A. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rick. There's some really, really interesting sort of nuggets of information in that research. And I think really helpfully, there's a lot of kind of practical things I can see, you know, that organisations can do. And I think if we have time, one of the things I'd like to pick up perhaps later is around that respect and speaking up. And I know we had a good discussion around inclusion and the impact on wellbeing. So we'll come back to that. But thank you so much. So now I'd like to hand over to Kim Hamrosi. Kim is the Executive Director of our operation in Australia. There are some really interesting changes going on in Australia in terms of now more accountability and responsibility on employers for the well-being of employees. So Kim, if I can hand over to you perhaps to give us a bit of an overview of what's happening and most importantly what businesses are doing in response.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. Lovely to be here, and I'm very happy to share what's actually happening in Australia around this area, around the reforms that are occurring around psychological health and safety. In terms of us as a chapter, we actually have a working group around psychosocial risks, and we have a number of our member organisations quite heavily involved in this. So it's really a topical topic of the area of focus for us. And we are currently in the process of working with one of the academic universities in producing some modules around psychosocial risks in Australia, because there are so many codes of conduct. We have various states, we have different legislation and regulations. So trying to kind of pull this together into a document to help our members, but also pull together some case studies about what organisations themselves are actually doing. You know, it's really because of all the changes that are occurring, many of our organisations are very much grappling with these changes and what they actually need to do to meet these obligations. Because there's been a fair amount of change in the area, and the approach to dealing with psychosocial risks, and many of these, Rick touched on those within the workplaces. As a workplace and health and safety issue over the past 12 to 18 months, it's no surprise that we're finding that organisations and our members are increasingly saying, we don't know if we're meeting our obligations under the law. Will the regulator come after us? So there's a lot of concern about our employers because they really want to do the right thing. And today, actually, we ran a session for our members, which we had a panel with 3 of our law firms, and they're people who were experts in this area, and we had a Q&A around all the changes around our legislation and what was expected of organisations and employers in order to make sure that they're meeting their obligations. And this came because last year we had a lot of activity around our work health and safety, with many of our ministers across the states committing to amend our workplace models of health and safety regulations. And we now better address psychological injury and psychosocial risk in the workplace. There's a lot of codes or several codes of practice that are currently being published. These are also being foreshadowed or approved. And we also have the whole international standard for the management of psychosocial risks being issued, which many of you may be familiar with, the ISO 45003. And that, you know, again, is another standard for organisations to consider and, you know, deciding whether they'll adopt that or whether they need to meet the model laws in Australia. In Australia, we do have an overarching Work Health and Safety Act and regulations for each of the states and territories. And we have now since 2011, because of the various states and jurisdictions we have a harmonised work health and safety laws that apply. Under those laws, our employers have a duty to ensure, so far as is reasonably practical, that workers and other people are not exposed to psychological health and safety risks arising from the business of an employer's business. And this duty is becoming, increasingly called out by regulators in Australia at the moment. So there's a lot of focus around the psychological aspects of health and safety. And it's been a challenge because of the various changes that we've had of how our organisations can deal with these psychosocial risks. And if they are able to not just eliminate them, but to also, as is reasonably practical, if they can't eliminate them, then they must be able to minimise those risks. And so, as mentioned earlier, there's been so many changes, and our organisations are really struggling to understand what they can do to meet their obligations. And we had a challenge here in Australia because there's a lack of consistency across our work health and safety laws, and it's been a challenge for each of our individual states and our businesses here that operate across the various jurisdictions to understand what model laws apply, what legislations apply, etc. The changes to our model regulations have recently now introduced some new provisions, and they actually define psychosocial hazards and clarify our duties in relation to these psychosocial hazards. And this now includes a requirement on businesses to have a regard for all the relevant matters when determining the control measures in order to implement and manage the psychosocial hazards within their workplaces. What this means in Australia now for many of our employers is that there is actually going to be a legislative definition of psychosocial hazards and a legislative requirement to manage those psychosocial hazards at work in the same way as other hazards apply. This in particular will force organisations to think about and think about the legislative requirements to take in a range of a lot of prescribed matters, which are listed in the regulations, and decide upon these sort of control measures that they should implement in their workplaces. And so it's very confusing for our people here because legislative requirements, there's codes of conduct, they're told that they have to do this. And while we don't have any legislative requirements, particularly around the definition of psychosocial hazards at the moment, organisations are deciding how they need to comply with these regulations when they become a law in their various states. And it's interesting because despite all this excitement and activity, we already have work health and safety laws that cover psychosocial risks in the general duties part of our thing. So we're already doing it, but because there's not been much emphasis over the last few years on it, the regulators are really coming down on organisations. So in terms of the advice today, we had, as the legal panel discussed, what our member organisations can do. And I think it's one of the key, that's some practical advice for our businesses to start to do. And many are already doing this and are in various stages of undertaking psychosocial risk assessments within their organisations using a variety of methodologies. And I think the most important thing was really understanding what the codes are within your state. How they apply to you. The other part is around identifying what psychosocial hazards you have within your particular organisation and then building this robust process around them. And unfortunately, it's not a cookie cutter approach to any of this for many of our organisations because everybody has different hazards and risks associated. So a law firm will have very different risks associated with them than say perhaps someone with an airline. They have again a whole bunch of risks that they have to assess under the different people that are in there. One of the things, the challenges for many of our members is understanding what sort of methodologies that they can apply in order to meet their obligations. And there are a number of free surveys available. So many of them are conducting, we have one that's been developed in Australia called People at Work. There is another one called COPSOC. There is the ones from the Canadians. There's a lot of surveys out there. And the question that many of our organisations are saying, well, what do we use? What's the best one? What will give us the identification of hazards that we need? Again, that becomes such an individual organisation's tailoring around what their own particular needs are, and it really involves both a qualitative and quantitative approach. It's up to organisations then to ensure that whatever that comes out of these methodologies, that they're putting that they're assessing the risks appropriately, and they're putting in place these appropriate controls to manage the risks. And to make sure that they're reviewing it, and that was one of the things that really came up. It's not a set and forget. It's very much here is they constantly need to be looking back and saying, are we consistently applying our controls? And if we're not, why not? And the other thing that was really important that came out of these was, apart from having this very robust approach, was actually documentation, and that you can evidence your approach for our regulator, and that you act consistently against those controls that you've put in place. And if an incident then happens, you have a psychosocial incident in your workplace, you can actually review these. And this is one of the big things around making sure that you have a great, robust, strong complaints process. How do you manage the complaints within your workplace? How do you document them? And our regulators are very much looking at the process, because they may not necessarily understand the risks in your business, but they want to understand that the process that you have in place for managing and documenting these is really, really critical. In Victoria, they've actually introduced some new regulations just recently. So they're a bit of an outlier in the rest of the states. Most of us have come under the harmonised laws. In Victoria, they've done something slightly different. And they actually have a new regulation that comes into effect next month, which actually requires a detailed preventative plan to manage some of the health and safety risks. And they're talking about aggression or violence, bullying, exposure to traumatic content or events, high job demands, and sexual harassment. And they actually require organisations to have a written prevention plan in place. So they've really gone one step further with our requirements for our organisations around those particular areas. I think one of the challenges in our organisations too, with complying with this, is it's not a simple area. Psychosocial, psychological health and safety is not simple. It's not like a physical thing where you can say, scaffolding needs to be this high, you need to have a desk that's set up ergonomically for you. It is really a very complex area, and it will vary from individual to individual. So one of the things that they talked about is, this estimate based on a reasonable person with an average level of resilience. So how do you know whether something that might cause mental harm to somebody in your organisation might be something that doesn't cause it to somebody else? So it's a really tricky area that our organisations are trying to navigate. And it comes back to this discussion around the reasonable person, and then with an average level of resilience, and that you can take this into account. And one of the examples I thought that they used today, which was really good, was around that CEO. You would expect that they have a high level of resilience and capability to do a stressful job. They're used to having long hours, perhaps. They have a requirement to make critical decisions. So there's a lot more pressure on that, and you would expect that they would have a higher capability to be able to be more resilient. Whereas you might, in terms of the psychological risk, but someone that might work on a line worker or a frontline worker in a supermarket or something might have a very different level of mental capacity to be able to deal, and resilience to be able to deal with that. So you need to think about those aspects when you're taking into account your psychosocial risks. What we know from our regulators here is that they are very process driven. They're looking at, have you actually applied the process? What risk assessments have you done? Have you done an appropriate plan to deal with the hazards and that you've identified? And are you complying with these controls? One of the other things around has been here investigations for many of our organisations, and they're very, very intensive. There's concerns around reputational damage if you have an investigation. And they can often give the regulators very broad-ranging notice, resulting in a lot of data collection. So you have to collect all the certificates and every sort of interaction and complaint process. And so it's a lot of work that is on the employer if you are investigated. This is why they again highlight this whole process and record keeping as being critical, and keeping on top of compliance processes, and keeping on top of how you've recorded what you're doing in relation to any of the complaints. And it's all relevant evidence as well in terms of the psychosocial investigations. Today, we also covered off 4 really critical areas that we're seeing a lot of risks being identified. One is around sexual harassment and assault. We have a lot of FIFO workers, so in the mining industry, there's a whole now code of conduct around that. There's been controls put in place around alcohol consumption, etc., to minimise effects around that sort of fly in, fly out worker. There's you know, I think around that aspect there is the culture being a key consideration of what we think about what was acceptable 10 or 15 years ago, about what we said within the workplace around sexual harassment or sexual assault is very, very different to now. So it's a change of culture within organisations, and that's particularly prevalent and is being looked at increasingly. Bullying and harassment, I think that's probably our most well-known and understood area in Australia. We've got a lot of work that's been done around that. I think organisations have really kind of stepped up and know what they need to do around that in terms of putting in controls. The only thing I wanted to go back to Alison's comment earlier around new ways of working, was one around this concept of working from home and some of the newly identified risks that are coming out of working from home. And one of them was around domestic violence. And the consideration of those sorts of things that we never had to think about before COVID before. One of the other things was also around that working from home piece was, you know, isolation. People now, and we're not doing the same assessments that we used to do perhaps pre-COVID when people went to say, I'm going to work from home. You might have done more of an assessment around their working environment, and now we actually do probably not as much, because once COVID hit, everyone sort of went, you're working from home, and we haven't had the same assessments around their safety, both physical and psychological safety within their working from home environments. And so there's a lot of work and discussions around that. And then fatigue management and workload, which has been touched on by both Rick and Alison. You know, it is a really critical thing that we're seeing. It's a common complaint area increasingly, and it's complex to investigate, because you have to look at not just those sort of soft and psychological issues. You need to also look at the job design factor and around the length of people's working times. I'm not sure, I'm just looking at my time here. I'm not sure if I'm going to go over here, Alison, but I wanted to just share with you three companies that are doing things in this area. And as I mentioned earlier, we have, so just in terms of our chapter size, we have about 25 organisations that are part of our membership, with a reach of about 500,000 employees across Australia. And we have organisations of all sizes, from 150 people right through to 200,000 employees. And they all work across various sectors in terms of technology, professional, legal, financial services. We have agriculture, FMCG. We even have an airline. Qantas has recently joined us as an Australian airline. And so our members are all at various stages of what they're doing, but also at various have various challenges because of the workforces that they have. Some have incredibly diverse workforces, say an airline or some of our retailers. Some of our financial services are more homogenous in terms of the approach that they can take. So I wanted to say, just share a couple of things. One of our, a couple of our large, or a large retailer is currently doing around their assessment work. So the things that they did as a stepped approach was really looking at all their internal data as a first point, looking at their safety data, their HR data, workers' compensation data, and actually pulling and collating all of that and getting a picture of what that looks like. They then pulled in a lot of their qualitative data from what their engagement surveys have said, and they've pulled in it over the last 2 to 3 years to understand some of the themes and trends that they're seeing. Then they've done another thing called the Thrive at Work assessment, which was done, some work by a woman called, if anyone wants to look up, it's the Future of Work Institute in WA at Curtin University, and Professor Sharon Parker does a lot of work around workplace factors. So if you're looking at risks around the workplace factors, job design, etc., she has done some incredible work and has published some amazing work around that. And she has a Thrive at Work assessment tool that's available as well, that you can do that to help understand some of the job factors as well.
Kim, sorry to stop you there, Kim. I'm just conscious of time. We've got a few other contributors. No, it's absolutely fascinating and so interesting, and I wish we had much more time this morning. But Kim, one of the things that I'm quite taken with is obviously how, I suppose, advanced the efforts in Australia, and I would not be surprised if that's something that we see a little bit more in the future in the UK. And just the ISO standard that you mentioned, Kim. If you are signed up to ISO, then you will have access to that standard. But we've in the chat copied a link to an abstract from the ISO 45003, which I would highly recommend you look at, because there's a lot of information in there in terms of expectations of what organisations should be doing in relation to this. So yes, and just in the creation of the ISO standard, I was hearing from the Health and Safety Executive in the UK that they were quite surprised at the number of organisations who are not undertaking the psychosocial risk assessments as expected. So I would certainly recommend perhaps having a chat with your health and safety teams just to see what is happening at the moment. So Kim, thank you so much for your contribution. That has been amazing. Thank you. Just moving to some of our member insights, and Maha, if I can come to you now. Maha Eldamaki is the head of payments supervision at the FCA. So Maha, it'd be great just to hear about how perhaps the FCA as an employer are thinking about wellbeing risk in the organisation. Over to you.
Thank you. So just to be fair to my colleague Paul Rowe, who took over from me as head of payments, I'm actually head of early and high growth oversight. Slightly nuanced, but I just want to be fair to Paul. So in terms of well-being risk, I think well-being as a topic has been really prevalent within the FCA for a number of years now. Pre-pandemic, obviously it was heightened throughout the pandemic, and all of the the interventions and the programs that you'd expect, we have in place things like an employee assistant program. We have a wellbeing strategy. We have all the kind of the access to the various professionals. We've got mental health champions and mental health first aiders within the organisation, so trained staff to actually perform those roles. We also track sickness. We track the various levels of or types of sickness, look at any correlations, understand how our workforce is being impacted. COVID obviously heightened all of that, and interestingly, the conversations that were had resonated actually with what we saw as well. And so we did see throughout COVID that those first 12 months were very much focused on well-being, on kind of connecting with staff, etc. And then it seems like there's now a bit of a fatigue of that, but there's also a lot of uncertainty around what this new hybrid working actually means for people, and it means different things for different people, and how we then look at implementing it in the right way and setting kind of whether it's policy or kind of the flexibility. I mean, that's just something that all organizations now are working through, because everyone has different responses to what this new world needs to look like, particularly with the revised kind of living patterns, if you like, around work that everybody has established. So crucially, we also offer resources to our people leaders. So there's a lot of focus on our people leaders. But again, Alison, your point around people leaders, managers, senior leaders are actually becoming fatigued with that, when they are, they're human beings themselves, and they have to also make sure that they're looking after the well-being of everybody else. I'm the champion, the senior sponsor of Embrace, which is our network group that looks after that has membership of individuals who identify with mental and physical challenges, if you like, and conditions. And we recently conducted a listening exercise. This would have been late last year. We called it a listening exercise, and we opened it up to the entire organisation. And there was a large number of questions that we asked around mental health, around anxiety, around uncertainty, concerns, what might be some of the triggers, and we really collected. 2/3 of the organisation actually filled out that survey. Not 2/3 of our membership, 2/3 of the entire organisation. And actually taking that really rich data to the point, number of points that were made around data. We took some really rich data to our SLT, to our EXCO, to our board, and we looked at what we need to put in place in terms of interventions. That cultural piece that was mentioned, a huge discussion around the triggers around systemic issues rather than just an individual solution, if you like, per person. We haven't got it all cracked. I mean, this is hard, right? And so we're working through some of the things, some of the findings of that survey. We want to look at what other data points we can use on a regular basis, because that was such a large exercise and we had to be really careful with GDPR and things like that. But recently we've also, we think hybrid working, coming back into kind of that hybrid working back into the office, is causing a mixed bag of responses from employees, and actually some anxiety for quite a few that have, you know, changed the pattern of their life around sort of working from home and picking up kids and other caring responsibilities, or whatever it may be that actually is important in your life. So we've launched a hybrid working survey that's actually in train at the moment. We've done a trial in terms of return to office, so we've done it really slowly. We didn't want to kind of, you know, just do a big bang approach. You must come back 2 days a week, or, you know, we do 1 day. Let's trial it. Let's kind of let's look at ways in which we encourage people to kind of come back and almost get reintroduced to the office. So over the summer we did a lot of that. We thought this was a really important point to kind of get everybody re-engaged with that. And recently, actually, one of the things, and this again was mentioned throughout, we've launched what we're calling our workplace adjustments passport. It's not a unique term that we've made up. It's used elsewhere. But ultimately, those who do need those adjustments, that they, you know, and whatever those adjustments are, at the moment, it's that agreement with your line manager on what those adjustments are, but you document them. And so if another line manager comes in, you don't have to go through that entire conversation again to kind of secure those adjustments. And at some point, we want to kind of develop that to make it a little bit more formal, a little bit more part of our policy. So we work very closely with our HR partners, you know, to do that. But all of the concerns that you have there, I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is, we've got this silver bullet and it's all working. It's just a trial and error on a lot of different interventions, but it's very much front and center. And we do believe that, you know, there is an element of risk. Again, for the FCA, our workforce is our biggest asset, and so we need to make sure that we're looking after them. And so this is a really important, an important topic for us. I'll stop there. I don't want to take too much time, but that kind of gives you a flavour of some of the initiatives and interventions that we're putting in place.
Oh, thank you so much. And Mahar, I imagine that, you know, with that level of response, you must have an awful lot of insights into, you know, the sort of experiences and views of your employees. So I think that would be interesting to see, you know, what comes of that in the longer term. And I think it's wonderful that, you know, you have all of that kind of listening going on. And one of the things I really liked what you said about sort of this kind of piloting, and actually that brings me nicely onto our next contributor. We talked a little about the need to continually reset and assess what we're doing and how we're approaching employee wellbeing. So Maha, thank you. And on that note, Barak, I'd love to bring you in. Barak Kaplanoglu is the Director of Sustainability at PwC. So Barak, over to you.
Thank you. I have to say this call this morning has been fascinating. So thanks to everybody for their contributions. It's really nice to meet really like-minded people as we face kind of very, very much the same challenges. So Kim, from an interesting perspective, from an Australia perspective, I'm working very closely, started to work very closely with PwC Australia, because you are in many ways leading the way. So for anybody who actually really wants to find out where the future steps for the UK might be, I would strongly recommend to connect with your businesses in Australia and see what kind of practical steps they're taking. But one of the interesting things is that, let's go back to the point, is that I work in the ESG team, as Alison said, and actually health and safety, well-being is part of the social agenda. And it's very interesting that most organizations kind of right now feel driven by regulation. It's similar kind of approach, I would say, to ESG as well, in terms of environmental impact. There's a lot of similarities we find between the E and the S and the drivers that we see. As you said, I think it was Alison and others have mentioned the pandemic, the burnout has been a real challenge. But one thing that we see is that it is no more just about the benefits package. So there are all organizations kind of looking at this, realizing that it's a real issue that actually hits the bottom line. So how do the organizations portray to be responsible, but equally also drive business forward? So that's a really interesting conundrum. And you need to have these honest conversations with your leaders to kind of put that right in the center. Something that we have seen is that we got to decouple well-being. It's very hard for most people do that. It's a bit like the CSR agenda. It used to be something on the side. It used to be something about, doing good. It actually is essential now for businesses. So it relates to culture, leadership, and the systems. Something that you mentioned, I think, Alison, and others, about the D&I agenda, innovation, collaboration. There is something about how the work feels differently anymore. And we are all in a new territory. And I will share with you some of the research. So recently, on the 26th of May, we had a research. I'm going to put this on the link. It's called the Hopes and Fears. And I'll share with you some of the highlights. This is a survey that's been done with 52,000 people, 44 countries, just to get an idea of what are the hopes and fears of the workforce. Something that came out, and I think it was at the introduction, is that people are talking about sensitive topics. Whether you like it or not, as an organization, whether you want to be open about it, 65% of the people have said they actually have spoken about social, political, challenging topics at workplace. So this conversation is already ongoing, and it's a very important thing as an organization for you to kind of recognize that. And organizations who are in the front foot, who create that kind of neutral platform for people to have these conversations, by the way, some of them will be uncomfortable for sure, they actually find lots of benefits to it. When we did the survey, 71% of the respondents said that at least there is one positive outcome of that. Majority of it was related to understanding your colleagues and where they come from. We've seen in the, and especially in the ESG agenda, in terms of different priorities, different value sets, there has been a lot of tension within organizations as well as within society. And as businesses, we are part of society. So we really need to recognize that. And it actually is a good pressure valve rather than something you continue to ignore. So I've done a little work in sports. It's the same kind of thing. I have to say, I do ESG in sports, and in sports now they realize that they actually need to deal with the political issues. They can't just say we are sports anymore, and the whole political issues and the economic issues. The second thing that's really interesting, which I'm sure won't surprise anybody who has been on this call so far, is that I have seen that 4 out of 5, when you ask people about meaning, of course, right now, 71% say financial rewards is top. But if you look at the other ones, 69% job fulfillment, 66% bringing true self, 60% team cares. These are all the psychosocial risk factors. It's not that people actually knew about that. I actually went back to the HSC definition and I actually double checked that. It is identical. It's fascinating what 52,000 people said and what authorities, regulators are kind of telling us. So when we ask people, there are 5 factors why they are leaving jobs. By the way, great resignation, as per the survey, is definitely not over. And if this group is all about financial services, majority, the skilled workers, the specialist workers are the first ones to leave your organization. And they are actually already actively looking. So there is a huge amount of people already in the marketplace looking for places where they will be more welcomed and they will belong more and they will feel more safe. So that goes back to the point Rick made. It's about being respected. It's about being part of a society, a group of people where you feel safe and respected. So this is a huge drive now post-pandemic that's already happening. In the survey, believe it or not, this is very interesting from many people's perspectives, especially leaders who are mainly financially driven. Job fulfillment was the #1 reason for people to leave. #2 is true self. Only #3 is financial rewards. Then it's team collaboration and managers listening. So all the points Maha made about listening is fundamental in terms of an organization to kind of supercharge this and be able to understand what is really shifting in the workforce. We all know today is an employees market, not no more an employer's market. So it's actually not just smart business, it's actually the right kind of business decisions for you to listen to your employees. You might not like everything they say, you might not agree with everything they say, but it's absolutely fundamental. But it's also really fundamental is that we have done a second piece of research, which is not public. So I'll share that with you in terms of insights. We have done a piece of research about the effectiveness. I think Alison said, is your investments having the impact of well-being programs? So we found through that research 4 gaps, and they're actually quite significant gaps. The first gap is a bit like ESG. What leaders and CEOs are thinking they're doing versus what employees are thinking they are doing. So lots of leaders believe that they're doing a lot of stuff and they think it's about benefits package, it's about the extras they have given to people. Actually, workforce doesn't believe that or doesn't feel that. Second gap is personalization. loads of packages, loads of benefits people have given, we found out that there's a big gap between the wants and needs of the workforce versus the actual availability of what's available to people. It can be very, very different things. Everybody's an individual. I think it was Kim and others mentioned about the personalization, how important that is to understand the individual. And then the third thing, which is I think Alison mentioned, is data. There is really very little data about how effective what you're doing is. What we found is there's a huge gap understanding the workforce. There's also a huge gap about whether your actions actually having real impact. And then the last but not least is integration into systems. And this is also a very interesting one. I know that, Kim, you mentioned the regulatory drive, but there has to be also a really good business drive in the middle of this, because what we learned is that it's of course personalization, but I'll share with you one of my own personal views is that I once worked for a consulting company, and you know what consultants are like, who travel a lot and out there, and I used to do international travel. I worked for this company 15 years ago that they were monitoring my workload and my work hours. And if I went on a business trip and worked over a weekend, they made me do these things called the take back days. I was actually forced to take time out, but it was built within the system. They didn't wait for me to fall sick, get bad and burn out. They actually were actively managing my time. So it's actually been fascinating for me that when I went and worked with other organizations, I realized that it's actually a very important data set that organizations actively don't monitor and don't manage. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's fascinating. But by the way, Maha, that was an organization. We were doing some cultural leadership in health and safety. We had to live what we were preaching, right? So you have to kind of practice these. So some of these things. So the biggest challenge, last point I want to make, and it's more of a personal point of view. Again, it's not necessarily PwC, and Alison and I discussed this. How do we go beyond the rituals? How do we go beyond the symbolic acts? How do we go beyond the additional perks in your package? How do we bring to the core of doing the business? So it's a bit like health and safety. Loads of people hold handrails, they do symbolic stuff, but that's actually really easy things to do, right? In terms of, you especially worked in heavy risk industries, oil and gas and others. But what's really, really difficult is to integrate that into the business of doing business. I personally genuinely feel the next step of well-being is that full integration. And that is going to be a journey for everybody. Because as you said, many of you, we knew how the world was before pandemic. We had to then be forced overnight into a lockdown. Now we're really all trying to figure out how this new world is. And this new world is definitely different. Nobody really has all the answers. And all I would say, this is a truly adaptive challenge that we need to all find a way to work it out. And going back to the first point, this call is called well-being risk. If you take the true definition of a risk, it has two factors, right? There are threats and there are opportunities. I would love to come from the point of opportunity, because as an organization, if you genuinely believe in it, and if you genuinely get your leaders engaged and understand the bottom line impact, as well as reputation and regulatory and all sorts of other impacts, it can truly transform the way of future of work. I'm going to stop there for now. I hope it does make sense.
That was a wonderful way to end, Barak. And I just want to say I'm sorry we haven't got time for more of a discussion or a Q&A, but I certainly think this is the first of many conversations around this topic. I've learned a huge amount. I think there is a real emphasis now on organizations really needing to address this. And I think to the point that, that we've done a lot of the easy stuff. I think now it's about really looking, internally in our organizations at the things that, do need to be addressed. So I'll leave it there now. We will hopefully have a follow-up conversation in the not too distant future, but certainly this is, I think, a role for the Alliance really to be looking at these issues. So thank you so much for your time this morning. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a lovely weekend. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.